the Ripper, a name that conjures fear, the most famous, the most iconic serial killer in history.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The violent story of the Ripper is so shrouded in myth that outlandish theories still surface, making it hard to separate fact from fiction. In the continuing story of Jack the Ripper, for the first time we can present the truth about what actually happened. We bring the streets of Whitechapel in 1888 back to life to see the Ripper's dark world. Taking the original police reports, witness statements, and research by the world's leading authorities, and using maps and photographs, even lighting the streets as the murderer would have seen them, we reconstruct Whitechapel as it was then, revealing new clues about what really happened and who the Ripper really was.
She was cut up like a pig in the park.
This is the definitive story of Jack the Ripper. By late September 1888, there had been 4 unsolved murders of prostitutes in Whitechapel. On the night of the 29th of September, Elizabeth Stride was found in Berner Street with her throat cut. She would be only the first of Jack the Ripper's victims that night.
Elizabeth Stride was different to all the other victims because she only had her throat cut. She had no abdominal mutilations.
Dr. Frederick Blackwell was summoned by the police from his nearby surgery.
At about 10 minutes past 1, I was called to 40 Berner Street by a policeman where I found a woman who had been murdered.
More like.
Her head had been almost severed from her body, and in her hand she held a box of cashew. One of her hands was smeared with blood, suggesting that she struggled. She could not have been dead more than 20 minutes.
Dr. Blackwell put the time of death at between 12:46 and 12:56 a.m.
When the body was undressed, it was noted that there was a bluish discoloration over both shoulders, especially the right, and under the collarbone and in front of the chest. These marks were produced by pressure from 2 hands.
Stride's death was different from the others, that she was attacked from behind. She was wearing a scarf. This was pulled tight as she was jerked backwards. The murderer, I suggest then, grips both shoulders and bangs her down onto the ground. This would explain the bruising on the backs of the shoulders. He could have rendered her very quickly unconscious and then, rotating the head, cut the left carotid artery, which was the method he used on the other victims, and in cutting the throat, he cuts the edge of the scarf, giving it a frayed appearance.
Could you tell me how?
The following day, a key eyewitness named Israel Schwartz went to the police with an interpreter and gave them perhaps the best description they had so far of the possible killer.
He is quite an important witness in that he saw Elizabeth Stride being attacked 15 minutes before her body was discovered.
After leaving the police station, Schwartz was followed by a reporter for the Star newspaper who tracked him to his lodgings.
Excuse me, I wondered if I could have a word with you and Mr. Schwartz. I gather you saw something?
Did he? Looks like he saw the whole thing.
Really? Very interesting.
The Star report contained a potentially significant additional detail, that the attacker, seen by Schwartz, had pushed the woman by the shoulders into the yard. Although the passage was dark, our reconstruction of the street lighting reveals that Schwartz would have had a clear view of the man's face. But was he Jack the Ripper? The fact that Elizabeth Stride was not mutilated might suggest that she was the victim of another killer. But the reconstruction of what happened that night suggests a far more likely explanation, that the Ripper had indeed attacked Elizabeth Stride, but had been disturbed.
A murderer is an opportunist. The courtyard was very busy. There was a concert performance going on in the rooms behind him, so there would have been light in the courtyard. The gate was open and the entranceway visible for anyone walking down the street or coming through the gate, as did Deemschutz, the travelling salesman who discovered the body. I think he was hoping for time to perform his mutilations, which I suspect he was planning. But the location was wrong, the timing was wrong.
He cuts her throat. There are no other significant injuries. He is observed launching the sort of blitz attack that disorganised serial killers use to bring their victims under control. 2 people see him doing this, and he thinks, hold on, wait a minute, they might have gone for the police. I'd better get out of here.
He was killed by a cut. She was not mutilated because he didn't have the time. He was doing it among other people, and therefore he ran off and very shortly afterwards committed another crime, which was more his usual presentation. It makes sense.
That next attack would come just 40 minutes later on the fringes of the City of London, a little more than a mile away.
Oh, clear off the lot of you. There's nothing to see here.
Come on.
Earlier that evening, PC Louis Robinson had noticed a small crowd of people standing around a woman in Aldgate High Street. It was 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes, and he arrested her for being drunk and disorderly.
Catherine was born in Wolverhampton in 1842, and she was one of 12 children. In 1861, Catherine became a domestic servant. But then she's caught stealing at some point, and so she runs away, and she meets Thomas Conway in Birmingham. We found no marriage certificate for Catherine and Thomas, but they acted as common law husband and wife and had 3 children. And then in 1881, Catherine and Thomas separated. He basically blamed Catherine's drinking.
She took up with John Kelly, a labourer and jobber in Spitalfields Market.
How do you know Kate?
We were thrown together a good bit, and the result was that we made a regular bargain. We have lived here ever since, as the people here will tell you.
When returning from hop-picking in Kent, Catherine was given a pawn ticket that would ultimately lead to the identification of her mutilated body.
I've got a ticket for a shirt which might fit your old man.
Oh, Tar, love. Bless your heart.
The hop-picking had been so poor that they had returned to London penniless.
We're wiped out, John.
Don't worry, I'll get some work, yeah?
I'm going to go to my daughter's in Bermondsey, get some money off her.
She said she was going to her daughter's in Bermondsey to borrow some money, but whether that was her real intention or not is not known.
Don't think she had any intention of going to Bermondsey because she knew that her daughter wasn't even living there anymore. But where she was going and who she was going to see, I guess we'll never know.
What we do know is that Catherine Eddowes came face to face with Jack the Ripper. Five prostitutes had been violently murdered, and soon there would be a 6th. In the early hours of September the 30th, the Ripper had already killed once, but had been disturbed. Now, his lust for blood was going to lead him to kill again. Catherine Eddowes was about to be released from Bishopsgate Police Station.
What time is it?
Too late for you to get anything to drink.
I'm going to get a damn fine arguing when I get home.
Serves you right. You had no right to get drunk.
Good night, old cock.
Rather than heading for her lodgings, on leaving the police station, she turned left towards Houndsditch. It would prove a fateful decision. Mitre Square, just within the boundary of the City of London, was surrounded on all sides, mostly by tall warehouses. Poorly lit, it was patrolled every 15 minutes by PC Edward Watkins.
Mitre Square had 3 lamps in it. There was one in the entrance from Mitre Street. There was one in the entrance to Church Passage. These were both fixed to the wall. There was also a freestanding lamp across the way, but this was deemed deficient. Either it was not working completely, or it could be the faulty gas line, or even poor gas being used.
PC Watkins would later testify.
It was 1:30 when I turned out of Aldgate and passed round the next corner into the square. There was nothing unusual to be seen. I turned my lantern light in every direction. I'm positive there was nothing wrong at that time.
5 minutes later, 3 men leaving the Imperial Club in Duke Street made an important sighting. A woman was seen talking to a man at the entrance to Church Passage, a narrow alley which led into Mitre Square. Only one of the men, Joseph Lavender, took much notice of the couple.
I like walking home by myself. People like that around.
He described the man as of shabby appearance, about 30 years of age, and 5'7" or 8 inches in height, of fair complexion, having a small, fair moustache, and wearing a red neckerchief and a cap with a peak. At 1:40 a.m., PC James Harvey walked through Church Passage, stopping short of Mitre Square, which wasn't part of his beat. Had he entered it, he might well have seen the murder.
It was possible that Catherine Eddowes was in the corner of Mitre Square with her murderer as PC James Harvey came down Church Passage, and that he actually missed the couple in the corner.
Minutes later, PC Watkins came into the square and discovered the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes.
I can tell you, it didn't take me a moment to see the Whitechapel murder had been our way. She was cut up like a pig in the market. I've been in the force a long time, but I never saw such a sight.
The throat had been cut to the spine, and the knife had marked the cartilages in the vertebrae. And in this case, the killer had gone further still, leaving Eddowes' face completely mutilated. The tip of her nose had been cut off, and there were cuts in the eyelids and one of the ears, as well as triangular cuts to the cheeks. The face was so badly mutilated that she could not be identified from published descriptions, and her identity was only established when John Kelly recognized the pawn ticket she'd been given by Emily Birrell. When Watkins found the body, he sought help from George Morris, a night watchman who worked only a few yards away.
God's sake! Come to my assistance!
And Morris, being an ex-Met police officer, had a whistle, and it was he that blew the whistle and raised the alarm.
From what the eyewitnesses saw in and around the square that night, it's clear that the murderer must have conducted his savage attack in a matter of minutes. And the careful reconstruction of the lighting in the square reveals that he must have acted in almost total darkness.
You could say that they were opportunistic killings, that he took a huge amount of chances. And I think that's true. I think one reason why he took these chances is that he might not have been very bothered about the possibility of being caught.
The injuries were inflicted very quickly. However, they could not have been performed in under 5 minutes. And a long pointed blade of at least 6 inches was used.
The facial mutilations carried out on Catherine Eddowes were almost certainly random slashes. We know this because Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, who attended the inquest, noted in minute detail every single cut and slash perpetrated on her body.
The killer would have had to have a good deal of knowledge about the positions of the organs within the abdominal cavity.
Eddowes' abdomen had suffered a long zigzag cut reaching all the way from the base of the sternum down to the pelvis, and it was through this single opening that the Ripper was able to remove both her uterus and her left kidney. But there's no reason to believe that a Ripper simply reaching into the abdomen and grabbing any object of interest and cutting it out couldn't have done so with no surgical training whatsoever.
However, a butcher could perhaps possess this knowledge.
Dr. Brown's evidence produced a significant shift in the police investigation. Instead of looking for medical men, they now began looking for someone local who might know something of human anatomy. Shortly after the body was found, just a few streets away, a policeman made a startling discovery. A piece of what proved to be Eddowes' apron, covered in blood and feces. Above the apron was a message.
He saw a blood trace upon the wall, followed the trace up, and that's when he saw the wall writing.
One version has it that the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing, or the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing.
But the location of the message and the piece of apron, just a few streets from Mitre Square, but in the direction of Whitechapel, might also be a vital clue.
The discarded apron suggests that he was heading back. I would suggest to his home, to his hideout. Geographical profiling, which you use in modern murder investigations today, has him living within about 200 yards of Dorset Street. And it suggests that this was his hideout. This is where he's heading back to.
What is clear, however, is that the police did not make the best of this information.
The two murders took place in different police areas. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, so she was murdered in the City of London, and that brought the City of London police into the investigation.
What caused the disagreement was the message's inflammatory racial content.
That is evidently anti-Semitic graffiti. So the Metropolitan Police are remembering now the leather apron scare. 6 a.m. on the morning of the 30th of September, you're going to have the Petticoat Lane street market. But that graffiti pertains to an investigation being carried out by the city police. And what the Met sees as incitement to racial violence, they see as an important clue, and they want to photograph it. And so you've got this argument going on until at 5:30 in the morning, Sir Charles Warren turns up. He's in charge. He took one look at that. He said, no, it goes. And so it was the most controversial order probably that he gave of the entire investigation, that the writing or the graffiti was erased before a photograph of it could be taken.
The police desperately needed a break in the investigation, something to assuage public fears about the murderer. The following day, they released 2 notorious letters allegedly penned by the killer and signed Jack the Ripper.
I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get the ears for the police.
Both letters were written in the same hand and were sent within just a few days of each other.
Jack the Ripper.
As a consequence, the murders are now turned almost into a street pantomime, and 5 sordid East End murders became an international phenomenon, and the unknown miscreant responsible for those murders was elevated to the realm of legend.
On October the 3rd, the police began a house-to-house search that took over 2 weeks to complete. 100,000 handbills were distributed, but as the press reported, not the slightest clue to the murderer was obtained.
The police do a trawl through the area. In fact, Sergeant Thick told the journalist the inquiries were taking forever because each of the common lodging houses in Dorset Street could accommodate between 200 and 350, 400 people.
We don't know the kind of man the police were looking for, but in later years, Scotland Yard's man on the ground in Whitechapel, Frederick Abberline, advanced a theory of his own. Abberline believed the most likely killer was a Pole named Severin Klosowski, who also called himself George Chapman.
There are a score of things which make one think that Chapman is the man. You must understand that we've never believed all of those stories about Jack the Ripper being dead or a lunatic or anything of that kind. The date of the arrival in England coincides with the beginning of the first series of murders in Whitechapel. The fact that he studied medicine and surgery in Russia.
Klosowski's a compelling subject because he's known to have murdered 3 of his wives. He did so by poisoning them, which is possibly where his previous surgical training in Poland came into some sort of practical use.
And it's curious to note that the first series of murders was the work of an expert surgeon, while the recent poisonings proved to have been done by a man with more than an elementary knowledge of medicine. The story told by Chapman's wife about the attempt to murder her with a long knife while in America is not to be ignored.
The Chapman theory, whilst given additional credibility by being advanced by no less an authority than Abberline, suffers from one fundamental flaw. Why would Jack the Ripper have suddenly changed from throat-cutting to poisoning? The house-to-house investigation had produced no lasting suspects. Neither did the publication of the famous letters. The police were deluged with hoax communications, one of which stood out. George Lusk, a prominent local businessman and president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, received a small package.
from hell. Mr. Lusk, sir. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
A kidney had been removed from Catherine Eddowes' body and apparently taken away by her murderer. No one knows if the kidney sent to Lusk really had belonged to Eddowes or whether the message was from her killer. It was, nevertheless, chilling in the extreme. Jack the Ripper had everyone on his trail, including 2 London police forces and the country's top detectives. His elusiveness was nothing short of miraculous. The double event murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes horrified the public and press alike. But October would pass without a murder, and a slight sense of normality returned to Whitechapel. But the killer would strike again, and this time he would commit his most horrendous crimes so far. Mary Jane Kelly was just 25 years old and lived in a small rented room in Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street, the insalubrious thoroughfare which had once been home to Annie Chapman.
There's some more stuff about the murders. It says another revolting murder. More horrible than the previous one left in Bucks Row.
The stories and myths surrounding Mary Jane Kelly's life are many because the name is extremely common. The information that was given is that she was born in Limerick in Ireland, and when she was a small child she came across to Wales in Carmarthenshire. Her father was said to be a ganger of an ironworks there, but unfortunately for some reason Mary Kelly made her way to Cardiff to stay with a cousin, where it was said that she became a prostitute.
Kelly, who was reportedly an attractive young woman, eventually came to London, and according to her own story, she worked for a while in a posh brothel in the West End, where she had fine dresses and all the trappings that went with catering for a high-class clientele. She even claimed to have been taken to France by a gentleman. But if her story was true, something seems to have gone horribly wrong, because she made a swift decline into the stews of Whitechapel. In April 1887, she met a market porter named Joseph Barnett, and they almost immediately agreed to live together. They moved from one lodging to another, but eventually ended up at 13 Miller's Court. Miller's Court was entered through a narrow arched passageway about 20 feet long and a yard wide, which ran between number 26 and 27 Dorset Street. 13 Miller's Court could only be entered through a door in the passage. It was in the thick of this warren of houses that Jack the Ripper would commit his most savage assault.
Joe? Joe?
No,
What else can we do?
I don't care. You're not going back out there again. And I'm not having them filthy, stinking whores back here neither.
The couple broke up. Mary had no alternative but to return to selling her body on the streets. On the night of her death, Mary was drinking, and in the course of the evening met a series of men, one of whom could have been Jack the Ripper. At 11:45, she picked up a man. She was seen by another prostitute, Mary Ann Cox, a widow who lived at 5 Miller's Court. She described the man as about 36 years old, 5 foot 5 inches tall, with a fresh complexion and blotches on his face. He had a thick, carroty moustache and was dressed in shabby dark clothes and a black felt hat. He was holding a quart can of beer.
Have a song.
Mary was still singing at 12:30 a.m. Mary Ann Cox had gone out looking for customers, but returned to her room after half an hour. There was a light on in Mary's room, and she was still singing. At about 2 a.m., Mary Jane was back on the streets. A man named George Hutchinson spoke to her in Commercial Street, and from his account, it would seem that she'd sobered up considerably.
Hutchinson, could you lend me sixpence?
Sorry, Mary, I'm spending it all going to Romford.
Must go and find some money.
Mary walked off, and according to Hutchinson, she was approached by a man of Jewish appearance, wearing a soft felt hat pulled down over his eyes. He wore a long, dark coat trimmed with astrakhan and sported a large gold chain in his waistcoat. He was holding kid gloves and a small package. Hutchinson followed the couple and saw them enter Mary Jane's room. Perhaps hoping that their business would soon be over and that Mary Jane would take pity on him, Hutchinson waited for nearly an hour. His story is lent weight by the testimony of a passer-by who saw a man standing where Hutchinson claimed to have been. At about 4 o'clock, Elizabeth Prater was awakened by her cat, Diddles, and heard a faint cry of, "Oh, murder!" Such exclamations were fairly common in the East End, and she took no notice. The next morning, Kelly's landlord sent an agent to collect some rent money. It was 10:45. There was no reply to the knock on Kelly's door, so he looked through the window. And in the gloom of that tiny room, he saw Mary Kelly on her bed. She had been quite literally butchered. The police were called, and when they eventually gained entry to the room, they were greeted by a nightmare turned reality.
He cuts her throat from left to right back to the spinal column. He cuts her from vagina to breastbone, like the other victims. He takes out her heart. He then cut off her breasts with circular incisions, put one by her head, one by her feet. He cut off her stomach flesh in 3 flaps and put that on the bedside table. Sliced off her chin, her lips, her nose, her eyebrows, her eyelids, skins her cheeks, skins her forehead, completely disfiguring this corpse. And if that's not enough, he then slices off the flesh from her thighs, and you can see the exposed bones in the photograph we have.
It was an attack on everything. Every part of the body was attacked. He had obviously had time and opportunity to indulge in his wishes. I mean, it was an attack against the whole body, against everything.
He's fulfilling his cycle of hatred, and at long last, he's got the facility to do it. A room in which he can work for about 15, 20 minutes, which is what it would have taken him to inflict those mutilations without anybody coming along and disturbing him.
Please forgive me for the implication that I'm praising it, but it was Jack's masterpiece. Having done what he did in that room, I think that he could certainly take a break.
In the wake of the attack, the head of the CID at Scotland Yard, Robert Anderson, asked the highly respected police surgeon of A Division, Dr. Thomas Bond, to undertake the post-mortem and to review the reports of the previous crimes. Dr. Bond's report included his opinion of what sort of man the killer would be. It is generally regarded as being the first attempt at criminal profiling. Bond carefully sifted through the available evidence from the previous murders, studying the medical evidence and the eyewitness statements. He concluded that at least 5 of the women had been killed by the same person.
By a knife, used violently.
Their throats cut from left to right while they were lying down.
There were 2 distinct clean cuts on the left side of the spine. They were parallel with each other.
He also concluded that none of the women appeared to have struggled, from which it was deduced that the attack had been sudden. He described the killer as a man of physical strength, cool and daring, but in appearance,
quite likely to be a quiet, inoffensive-looking man, probably middle-aged and neatly and respectably dressed. He would probably be solitary and eccentric in his habits, was probably without regular occupation, possibly living among respectable people who suspected that he was not quite right in his mind at times.
Obviously, the work was that of an expert.
However, a butcher could perhaps possess this knowledge.
And unlike some of the previous expert medical witnesses, Bond did not think that the murderer had any anatomical knowledge, not even that of a butcher or a horse slaughterer. Instead, he believed the simple object of the murderer, as seen in its most extreme form in the murder of Mary Kelly, was the mutilation. News of Mary Kelly's death and Jack the Ripper's unparalleled levels of savagery shocked people around the world. It was compounded by the news that same day that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, had resigned. The inquest into Mary Kelly's death opened on the 12th of November, this time under a new coroner to the case, Dr. Roderick MacDonald. Much to everyone's surprise, he concluded the inquest in a day.
The fact that the inquest was over with so quickly did starve the press of the lurid speculation of going after witnesses, of finding out things. And so, rather than escalate after what was the most vicious of the Jack the Ripper killings, on the contrary, the press reportage begins to sort of fizzle out.
What we do know is that there were more murders, and that some could have been the work of Jack.
The very nature of serial killing is that you don't stop unless you're forced to do it for one reason or another.
First, the murder of Rose Mylett, whose body was discovered in Poplar that December. Though apparently strangled, just as the Ripper's victims appeared to be, she wasn't mutilated. The head of the CID, Robert Anderson, certainly didn't believe the Ripper had anything to do with it.
But not for the Jack the Ripper scare. No one would have thought of suggesting that it was a homicide.
Then there was the killing of Alice Mackenzie in the middle of the following year. This one bore all the classic signs of the Ripper's signature.
Her throat had been cut, or rather stabbed, and there were abdominal mutilations. Dr. Thomas Bond stated that he thought she was a Ripper victim.
The discovery of a woman's dismembered torso in September 1889 in an area surprisingly close to Berners Street sparked yet another Ripper scare. But the final significant Whitechapel murder occurred in February 1891. Swallow Gardens had once been a rural location, but by 1888 it was little more than an alley running under a railway arch. It was here that young Frances Coles was found with her throat cut.
The immediate suspect was a sailor by the name of James Thomas Sadler. He and Coles had actually spent several days together going around various pubs getting drunk. They'd argued, they'd split up. Within an hour of Frances Coles' body being discovered, he'd actually turned up at a lodging house, a little bit dishevelled and bloodstained. Then the police arrested him on suspicion of having murdered Frances Coles.
All right, now come on, lads. Smarten up.
He was even put into an identification parade, although he wasn't subsequently identified.
Although press interest waned, the police continued their investigation. Two senior city detectives, Cox and Sagar, both later gave accounts of suspects they believed to have been Jack the Ripper.
We had many people under observation while the murders were being perpetrated. Certain investigations made by several of our cleverest detectives made it apparent to us that a man living in the East End of London was not unlikely to have been connected with the crimes. The man that we suspected was about 5'6" in height. He occupied several shops in the East End of London, but from time to time he became insane.
Suspicion fell upon a man who, without a doubt, was the murderer. Identification being impossible, he was not charged. He was, however, put into a lunatic asylum, and the atrocities came to an end.
The murder of Frances Coles marked the official closure of the police investigation of the Whitechapel murders.
The Ripper files were closed in 1892, 4 years after the murders. Because there had been no solution, the case papers were simply put away, which just means that they could have been reactivated at any time if any new information came forward.
For the last 100 years, the question of who is Jack the Ripper has been one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in the annals of crime, generating volumes of comment, analysis and speculation. But in fact, there were a number of suspects, and some senior policemen actually believed that they knew the identity of Jack the Ripper. The casebook of 14 unsolved murders, the police continued to examine the evidence, and several believed that they had the answer to Britain's biggest unsolved crime.
In 1913, the journalist George Sims wrote to the then retired Chief Inspector John Littlechild and asked him if he was familiar with a Dr. D in connection with the Jack the Ripper murders.
Littlechild wrote back,
I never heard of Dr. D, but amongst the suspects, and to my mind a very likely one, was Dr. T, which sounds much like a D. He was an American quack named Tumblety and was one time a frequent visitor to London.
Dr. Francis Tumblety was wildly eccentric and dressed flamboyantly, often wearing a uniform, and was noted for his huge moustache. He was also homosexual at a time when it was illegal.
He was arrested for acts of gross indecency with several men, but he skipped bail and he eventually returned to America.
It's very rare for homosexual serial killers to kill women. Their victims tend to be other homosexuals.
Melville McNaughton, who had been Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police just after the murders, wrote a report in 1894 naming 2 probable suspects. Their names were Druitt and Kosminski.
Montague John Druitt was a barrister who was also working as a school teacher at a school in Blackheath. He was dismissed, for reasons we don't know for certain why, from his position as a school teacher at the end of November 1888, and shortly after that he committed suicide.
Melville McNaughton said that Druitt was sexually insane and hinted at information that suggested his own family thought he was the Ripper.
A Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor and of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on 31st of December. He was sexually insane, and from private info, I have little doubt but that his own family believed him to have been the murderer.
McNaughton favoured Druitt as Jack the Ripper, but today nobody knows why. What we do know is that if Druitt was the murderer, he must have been a very cool customer. Within hours of the murder of Annie Chapman, just a few miles away in Blackheath, he was playing cricket. As for McNaughton's other suspect, the man known as Kosminski...
Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There are many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect.
What we do know is that Robert Anderson, the head of the CID at the time of the murders, later wrote in his autobiography that not only was Jack the Ripper a Polish Jew,
very interesting,
but that he had been positively identified by an eyewitness.
That undiscovered murders in London are rare, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are not within that category.
The only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. But he refused to give evidence against him. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course.
In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact.
To the frustration of historians, Robert Anderson did not name his suspect. But Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the man who had overall responsibility for the investigation, did. In 1987, Donald Swanson's personal copy of Anderson's autobiography came to light.
Donald Sutherland Swanson was my great-grandfather. The book by Anderson had been found with my great-grandfather's notes in it. They seemed to me the correct and sober reflections of the man, above all, who knew most about the case of anybody, and that what he wrote was genuine and correct.
Swanson had made some penciled notes in the margins and on the end papers of the book, and he named Anderson's suspect as Kosminski.
Both Anderson and Swanson say that there was a witness identification of the suspect.
The witness refused to give evidence against the suspect, and the police were forced to release him.
On the suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, City CID, by day and night.
But his family almost immediately committed him to a lunatic asylum. Robert Anderson did not name his suspect, but McNaughton and Swanson called him Kosminski. But who was Kosminski? A careful search of the asylum records by the author Martin Fido produced only one Kosminski, Aaron Kosminski.
The Kosminskis were not a poor family. They were master tailors, and they did make a reasonable living and income in the East End of London.
The family ran a tailoring business in Greenfield Street in 1888, and it's probable that Aaron lived there, placing him at the epicentre of the crimes and only a matter of 600 yards from the murder of Elizabeth Stride. In 1890, his brother Wolfe had admitted him to the workhouse infirmary, where he was described as having been insane for 2 years. Though quickly released, in 1891, his family had him committed to the Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum, Colney Hatch.
He declares that he is guided, and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says he knows the whereabouts of all mankind. Jacob Cohen says that he walks about the streets and picks up bits of bread from the gutter and eats them, and he refuses food from the hands of others. He took a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He has not attempted any kind of work in years.
It is clear that by 1891, when Kosminski was admitted to the asylum, that he was not well enough to have committed the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. But that did not mean that he might not have been capable 2 years earlier.
Is it the Kosminski of 1888? We know, for example, that in 1889, that Kosminski had appeared in court charged with not having his dog muzzled in public.
Mr. Kosminski, why did you give a false name?
I goes by the name of Abrahams because Kosminski is hard to spell.
And in court he came across as very lucid. So obviously there's been a great deterioration in his condition from 1889 to 1891 when he goes into the asylum.
The diagnosis I've reached, also taking into account what happened further down the line, is that he suffered from a form of schizophrenia, which I would call hebephrenic schizophrenia. People suffering from schizophrenia are not more likely than other people in society to commit violent crimes.
What are you bleeding staring at?
There are occasions when schizophrenics can become extremely dangerous. A classic example here is Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper.
Go on up it, bloody weirdo.
Anderson and Swanson both appear to have believed he was the murderer. And they were in the position to know the evidence against all the major suspects. He's one of the suspects who we know was in the area at the time. He was schizophrenic, possibly psychotic, and also he's of the right age for a serial killer. So Aaron Kosminski certainly has to be high up on the list of suspects for the mantle of Jack the Ripper.
Did Jack the Ripper escape the clutches of the law because his family committed him to an asylum? We may never know. But we have followed the footsteps of Jack the Ripper into the dark labyrinth of London's past. We've met some of the men who the police believe to be the Ripper. We've revealed how he was an opportunistic killer who acted swiftly and must have had local knowledge. Above all, we have witnessed the extreme chances he was prepared to take and concluded it was only a matter of luck that he was not caught red-handed at his terrible deeds. And it is perhaps this simple fact, above all, that explains why, today, his name has become a legend, the most famous serial killer in history.
Next Monday at 9, Alex Polizzi's back, kicking off the new series of The Hotel Inspector. And tomorrow here on Channel 5, Horatio's discovering the dangers of using dating sites as the killer new season of CSI Miami continues at 9. The housemates are getting shaken up next tonight, though, in Big Brother.